to the Bet the Board podcast, powered by FanDuel Sportsbook. It's championship week on the college football gridiron, and there are passes to be punched to get into the college football playoff. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. But before we get things rolling, I want to encourage all of you, our loyal listeners, FanDuel.com/bettheboard. Take advantage of all the lucrative sign-up bonuses that FanDuel has available for you just in time for championship weekend. Whether it's 30-1 enhanced odds, $1,000 risk-free bets, there are so many different ways to get your money in and use it to build your bankroll for the upcoming bowl season. In Payne, we had another unveiling, the penultimate of the college football playoff rankings last evening. I don't think there was a single surprise, number 1 through 6.
I didn't even watch it. That's how I feel about this, right? I know people hate hearing that, but for me, it's like just roll out the games, and then we'll handicap them from there. All of the dog and pony show stuff and watching people argue with each other, and there really isn't. If we knew what the formula was, then I'd have a different mindset. None of it was shocking. It basically comes down to, I would say, win and you're in type situations, right? I think the only thing that's in flux this weekend, Michigan gets to number 2. I could see a situation where if they were to lose, right, some mayhem breaks. If Alabama is able to upset Georgia, I still think both get in, right? At that point, what are we doing? We've already heard the committee backpedal a little bit, right? We're going to evaluate teams that might have lost their coaches. So Brian Kelly may have really screwed Notre Dame there. But who else has an opportunity to get in here? It's basically Oklahoma State would slip into a spot with a win if one of those teams are fall. Are you removing Michigan if they lose this weekend from the top 4?
Yes, I think Michigan has to be removed from the top 4.
Okay. Now what happens if Oklahoma State loses?
It's a great question. You lay out that doomsday scenario. If Michigan loses, Oklahoma State loses, Alabama loses, how the hell do you fill out a college football playoff? I think it's Notre Dame, right, Cincinnati, Georgia, and pick your 4th.
Be a tough playoff to watch.
And suddenly, as ridiculous as it sounds, and you're talking about 2-loss teams and you want to default to a 2-loss conference champion, is it Iowa at 11-2?
No, don't even start that.
No, I'm not saying Iowa should be in the playoff, but I'm saying if you think about it this way and try and position
I tried getting us to not talk about this game. Talking Iowa football is like just staring at a piece of burnt toast. I don't know what would come of it, but boy,
just cancel the whole thing.
Yeah, just cancel the whole thing at that point. And if Kirby can't win a national championship at that point, boy, oof.
Yeah,
I think we're gonna have some pretty straight line stuff. The biggest debate will be if Alabama loses, are you keeping them in? What do you think there?
I don't think...
If Oklahoma State wins and Alabama loses...
I do not think Alabama, with 2 losses, given how they've performed, deserves to get in. Now, of course, everyone goes, well, what happens if they lose by a field goal in the waning seconds to Georgia and Oklahoma State slips by Baylor? For me, if Cincinnati wins out, they're in. If Oklahoma State beats Baylor, they're in, and that includes getting in over a 2-loss Alabama team that's looked anything but dominant when you want to default to game control or any of that other crap that they say factors into it. You outlasted an LSU team that finished 6-6. You outlasted an Auburn team because an Auburn running back wasn't smart enough to slide down and take 40 seconds off the clock to finish 6-6. If Alabama had been dominant in 10 of their games this season and happened to finish 10-2, okay, fine. I'm willing to give them a free pass. But this is the most flawed Alabama team that we've seen in recent memory. And of course, I say all that knowing we're going to break down Alabama and Georgia, and they have a chance like everybody else. Winning, you're in, and winning outright as a 6.5-point underdog isn't exactly a Herculean task in this day and age.
Tough game.
So,
listen, I think we'll see what unfolds, obviously. I'm not huge into this. I know you're into it a little bit more than I am. Again, just get us there, and we'll gauge the games from that perspective. I don't know if there's going to be a ton of mayhem that unfolds this weekend. Who knows? Could see that, but I'm hoping to keep it pretty straightforward. I don't mind the 4 that are in there now. Feels like the right 4. In my mind. I know Oklahoma State fans might disagree, but you are also drop pick 6 away from probably losing last week and being down 16 in the second half. So, there's some interesting things there. I don't mind the 4 now. That'd be ultimately, if we could just stop things, I think that's probably the best.
I'm not going to disagree. I think there's plenty of intrigue there. I know a lot of people go, well, Georgia'd be a massive favorite against Cincinnati. I know this Bearcats team isn't the same, but hey, look, they pushed Georgia last year. There would be a ton of pressure, as you talked about, on Kirby Smart and company. And let's not kid ourselves. This Georgia offense still probably leaves a lot to be desired for as electric as what we've seen from the Bulldogs on the defensive side. But we'll see the college football.
This 4 feels like the combination of the best and most deserving. And that's really what this is. It's a merging of the two because we don't have a perfect system. If this was simply, hey, just pick the 4 best teams, you don't need the goddamn committee. We'll just go to the sharpest guys in the world who bet hundreds of thousands of dollars on these games, and we'll tell you who the best 4 teams are. Right? Send the committee home.
Yeah. You also don't need to play the games during the regular season because I don't think the top 3 has changed from start to finish.
And that's why it has to be somewhat of a mix. We're all cognizant that Oklahoma State would be a small favorite over Cincinnati on a neutral. But at some point, there's got to be the deserving element here, or else there's no need to play any of these games. We'll just play them, play a game, right? Whoever recruits the best players, we know they're going to be the best, and we'll just have those teams. We'll just have them roll into the Final Four. So it does have to be this merging of the two of best and most deserving, and hell, right? Like everyone in the world at the time was like, Michigan State just beat Michigan, and number 3, baby. And it's like, I'm sitting here looking at my power numbers. The same people that are arguing put the best 4 in wanted Michigan State, who was like 25th in our power ratings at that time.
I mean, Payne, Michigan State did beat Michigan head-to-head, so clearly that's a lot more important than your full body of work. That's if we've learned anything from what the talking heads want to reference as their data points when it comes to college football. But we can go on and on with all of this. Obviously, nothing actionable right now. We'll get the 4 teams that'll make the college football playoff unveiled during your beloved NFL early on Sunday, and that'll make the picture a little bit clearer. But before we get there, 6 games to get to on today's show, and we may as well start things off with the game taking place in Vegas on Friday night, a rematch of a contest we saw a couple weeks ago that wasn't really much of a football game. Utah, 2.5-point favorites at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total in the game, 59.5, as they'll renew acquaintances with the Oregon Ducks. In that previous matchup, Oregon was held to their lowest rushing total of the entire season, just 63 yards, but a little bit different atmosphere. Anthony Brown won't be going into hostile territory at Rice-Eccles Stadium. You're not talking about a Utah team that could play loose and free in that spot. I'll say that a lot of the pressure is on the Utes, who have talked and been pretty open about trying to get to their first Rose Bowl in program history. Meanwhile, the Ducks make their 3rd straight trip to the title game. They're 4-0 in previous installments, and the Pac-12 North has dominated in the title game. Believe their numbers are 12-1, which was pretty unthinkable when you try and grasp the greater landscape, knowing that USC will obviously have a chance to get back into the thick of things. But when we look at that first game, Payne, how much of that carries forward to this one? Or is that more or less an anomaly where Utah bullied Oregon on the ground and Anthony Brown was spraying the ball all over against the Utah team that was playing extra men in the box to take away the Ducks' ground attack?
Not a lot's changed since we broke this down 2 weeks ago. And, we'll talk a couple matchups, but this is one of those old school coaching, like who executes better situation, and you hate to say that, but that's really what this game comes down to. The one thing that has changed, and pretty drastically though, is the price. Right? Utah opened 3-point favorites at home against Oregon 2 weeks ago, and the Utes have one of the best home field advantages in college football, at least 3 points, at least. And the last time Utah lost at home, I think you have to go back to September 15th, 2018 against the top 10 Washington team with fans in the stands. Did lose last year, no fans in the stands. So I think when you kind of factor in that home field advantage, suddenly when Oregon opens this week +3 on a neutral, all of a sudden the number grabbers are out, the value hunters who only focus on price, and they bet the Ducks +3, and that's why you're pretty much down to below that key number right now. There's a lot of moving parts, right? And I think that is somewhat of a factor, maybe, right? Like, I mean, we know USC just hired Lincoln Riley, so now Oregon goes from being tier 1 to tier 2 for recruits west of Texas. And is that ultimately what has Mario Cristobal returning home to Miami? We'll see. Joe Moorhead, the Ducks OC, appears to be the next Akron head coach. And then there were some rumblings that potentially Kyle Whittingham could retire. So there is some moving parts here that are very difficult to quantify. But they're at least existing, right? They're out there. As for the matchup, again, pretty straightforward. Like, you hit this perfectly. Utah's offense bullied the Ducks in the trenches 2 weeks ago. The Utes averaged 3.7 line yards against Oregon's defense. And for context, the number one team in the entire country this season in line yards is at about 3.2. So just pure domination. They ran away from Thibodeau. Utah churned out a positive .416 EPA per rush, which is just a ridiculous number. Everyone got involved, right? Tavion Thomas and Pledger and Bernard and Curry and quarterback was getting involved for a rushing touchdown. All those guys averaged over 4.5 yards a carry. Now, you would expect the Ducks to be embarrassed by that effort, right? You throw on the tape and you just see yourself getting manhandled there. So you would expect a little bit better effort up front with revenge. But at the end of the day, right, we're 13 weeks through the season, right? You kind of are who you are. And Oregon right now 66th in defensive line yards, outside the top 70 in stuff rate, outside the top 100 in power success rate allowed. In Utah's offensive line, we knew there was a bunch of young, talented guys. It was really deep coming into the season. We were just kind of waiting for them to emerge, and they have 14th in line yards on the season for Utah's O-line. So there is this mismatch there on paper. Oregon, by the numbers, does have an advantage on the ground as well. Ducks have one of the best O-lines in football. Utah, as you pointed out, sold out to stop the run in Week 12, forced Anthony Brown to be a passer, and spraying it all over the park, I think, is putting that nicely. He was horrific. And so that's interesting here, and I think that's probably the element, right? It's like Cam Rising versus Anthony Brown. And that's where that game was decided. Obviously, there was some trench warfare there where Utah just crushed them. But because of that, in the first matchup, Oregon had a 19% success rate on passing downs. That's exactly what we said. Put Anthony Brown in these known passing situations and he'll struggle. Utah, on the other hand, they made the change to Cam Rising. He's been fantastic. In that game, Utah, 42% success rate on passing down. So Cam Rising, the much better passer. The other wild thing here is Oregon has the number one pass rusher in the country, yet in known passing situations, the Ducks are 125th in sack rate. Utah, 14th in sack rate allowed on passing down. So even in that situation where Oregon was getting some stops, or even in this game where Oregon could get some stops on the ground and you're presented with, third and medium, Cam Rising's just been fantastic in that area. So that's kind of the other battle here. It's not just which team can stop the run. It's all of a sudden we have this quarterback situation where one team is substantially better suited in third and medium, and that's Utah. Now, if you get the Anthony Brown from last week's Civil War game,
he was good last week.
The Ducks are getting revenge here, right? Hell, if Anthony Brown played the way he did last week, the Ducks are undefeated and in the college football playoff, and there isn't a chance Mario leaves. Anthony Brown was out of his mind. 82% adjusted accuracy rate, 0 turnover-worthy throws, averaged 9.8 yards an attempt with a 132 passer rating. You get that guy Friday night against Utah along with this inflated price, and the Ducks are Pac-12 champs, but that's a big if, right? And if Mario and Moorhead both have one foot out the door, the inflated price I mentioned isn't going to freaking matter. So I'm still kind of poking around here informationally. It's very clear that the number grabbers, the value hunters, have certainly taken early week position on the Ducks, and they did so at +3. It'll be interesting. Ultimately, I think this game probably should be priced more like a pick'em, but you do have some external circumstances past, just the game that I still want to kind of figure out here.
Yeah, perception definitely takes on a big role, but it's pretty wild to think about a game where recreational bettors were jumping over men, women, and children to try and take the Ducks +3 in Salt Lake City. And in this particular spot, a little bit of a different narrative laying out early on when you see indications that the betting will be much more balanced. And it's the professional bettors trying to grab any 3.5s that were out there, even gobbling up, to your point, some of the 3s that were there. From Friday night into Saturday, yet another rematch. This time it's in the Big 12 championship game, where Oklahoma State and Baylor will go down to Arlington to do battle. It's Oklahoma State, a 4.5-point favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total on the game sits at 46.5. This will mark the first time since 1998 where neither Texas or Oklahoma will play for the conference title. Oklahoma State looking for their first conference crown since 2011. State appears to be the best positioned, obviously, to get into the playoff if other teams slip up around them. When you look at what Baylor has done, Payne, they didn't miss a beat, relatively speaking, without Gary Bohannon over the last couple of weeks, but they had to withstand one of their sloppier efforts last weekend in Waco to just get by Texas Tech to punch their ticket to this particular game. As you look at the first meeting between these teams, unlike Utah and Oregon, it didn't happen just a few weeks ago. It was significantly earlier in the season. Baylor players and coaches have been pretty outspoken about how we're not the same football team, yada, yada, yada. When you look at Oklahoma State, defensively, that was kind of their coming out party. But what's the one matchup that you're going to have your eyes on here to see if Baylor can get revenge or if Oklahoma can rinse and repeat and put themselves in a great position, at least as the one team on the outside looking into the college football playoff trying to punch their ticket?
Well, let me ask you this, because I think this will be a better exercise and a little more fun. Who would you say has exceeded expectation in preseason price more this season, Baylor or Oklahoma State?
Baylor. I mean, I thought Baylor was going to be in the lower third of the Big 12. Oklahoma State, I thought was going to be in that second tier, but if you'd have told me Baylor was going to rattle off the season that they had, I'd have told you were absolutely nuts.
Okay. And so Oklahoma State closed -4 at home against Baylor in week 5. And then the Pokes opened -6.5 on a neutral this week. And keeping all things fair, right? Like the Pokes trailed at home by 9 in the second half against Oklahoma State, despite a kickoff return touchdown. And again, would have been down 16 if not for a drop pick 6 to a team where its head coach had one foot out the door. And if you remove the first quarter where Oklahoma State shocks the shit out of the Sooners by going with this helter-skelter tempo for the first time all season and builds a lead, the Pokes probably aren't in this game. And so, it becomes interesting with the price. And I think that is initially why we have seen some money come in on Baylor at 6.5, along with some cheap buys to 7, especially knowing the total was going to dip, and we're as low as 45.5 right now. You also look at Oklahoma State in last week's game, and I know you were, I believe, on the road, but they had the advantage of Oklahoma being called for 12 penalties. Anything that was 50-50 on the last drive of the game was not being called. And I just kind of, again, say all that to say this. Like, I understand completely why Baylor is being number grabbed here. And we're down to basically 5.5. The problem is you dig into the matchup, and it doesn't necessarily look great for Baylor. And based on what I saw from Bohannon's body language on the sidelines last week and what I'm reading so far this week, and tell me if I'm wrong, I think we kind of had this conversation via text, the signs would point to more Blake Shapen than Bohannon. And I know Bohannon's going to practice, and Aranda said Bohannon is the face of the program, so maybe they stick him out there at less than 100%. So that's basically what this handicap is. So it's either Bohannon out there with a bad hamstring, and his best attribute is mobility, and he was really struggling, I would say, for about 2 or 3 weeks leading up to the hamstring injury at K-State, or it's a true freshman. If it's Shapen, it's one thing to preserve a double-digit lead against Kansas State's defense that didn't prepare for you. It's one thing to kind of sneak away with a win at home against a Texas Tech defense that is outside the top 100 in EPA per play allowed. But I think it's kind of a different ball game here if you're asking a 3-star freshman in a conference championship game, the biggest game of his life, to have success against this Oklahoma State defense that now has 2 data points and 2 pieces of film on you, right? It's kind of a tough ask, I think, for Blake Shapen. So let's monitor that quarterback situation for Baylor. We know Baylor wants to be run first, 60% run on the season. Smith and Ebner, really a awesome duo in my mind. It's a great tandem, especially since their styles complement each other. And we saw Ebner, just one of the better pass-catching backs. He was out there running routes like a receiver last week against Texas Tech. It's really fun to watch. But Baylor's O-line isn't great, and defense is schemed to stop the run first. So Baylor's outside the top 60 in rushing success rate. Baylor's O-line outside the top 60 in line yards, outside the top 90 in stuff rate allowed. And to me, the Pokes front seven is the best part of their defense. Only 27% of runs have graded successful against them all season. They're also top 5 and defensive line yards, opportunity rate, and stuff rate themselves. So it just kind of feels like Chapin or Bohannon, they're going to be forced to win more than usual on passing downs, right? The reason Oklahoma State won and covered in the first meeting is because of that exact thing. Baylor had a 14% success rate on passing downs. So that, to me, is the big matchup here. If Baylor can't run, we now have Bohannon, who's not the most polished passer and isn't 100%, throwing the ball. Or we have Blake Chapin, who I think is a slightly better passer, but in the biggest game of his life, throwing the ball. And that to me, gets a little bit shaky, right? And I think the other side is Oklahoma State. You could say Spencer Sanders has started to play the best ball towards the latter part of the season. I think he's improved under pressure. And then you've kind of opened my eyes to Tay Martin. He's been damn good. And I think that's the area of weakness also for Dave Aranda's defense, is that secondary. Now, I don't think Spencer Sanders is going to completely shred you, right? I don't think he's competent enough to be like, hey, we're just going to dominate through the air and take advantage of a secondary that's outside the top 50 in passing success rate. And they've had some breakdowns in the back end, 2 huge gashers last week against Texas Tech. But I do think he can be efficient enough to find Tay Martin and have some success through the air there. So it's just, this to me is, as we wake up this morning, Todd, right, we're starting to see some of the sharper shops trend back towards 6 on Oklahoma State. And matchup-wise, I can see why.
Yeah, there definitely aren't a whole lot of advantages for Baylor, and I think you talking about some of the big plays they gave up to Texas Tech, somewhat uncharacteristic, but it's a secondary that's shown some vulnerability in the past. For me, going back and watching some of the Oklahoma State-Oklahoma game, other than the tempo that Coach Gundy's bunch employed early on in that game, I think it was really the first time all year that we saw Spencer Sanders lean a lot more on his legs, which creates a different dynamic that Baylor's going to have to contend with as well. 16 carries for 93 yards, including a long of 37. And whether that was by design or necessity, with an Oklahoma State ground game headlined by Jalen Warren that really hasn't been as dynamic, it's still a different element to see Sanders running, because he has improved as a passer, to your point. And when you look at what he's accomplished, I mean, this is a guy who's not going to blow you away with any of his measurables, but still 23-7 as a starting quarterback. He's been a little bit better in terms of protecting the football. And when you have a veteran-laden defense that Jim Knowles has continued to heap more on their plate each and every week, it allows you that luxury and flexibility where your quarterback doesn't have to be the be-all, end-all, and you're okay saying, if we need a punt and pin, our defense will get the ball back and we'll be able to flip the field.
I completely agree, and that is the one element that you have to factor in as well, right? When you have that mobile quarterback and the game heightens, all of a sudden we have to factor in a different type of offense, right? We're going to probably tick that offense up in a mobile game where it's a must-win situation or it's a monster game, right? You're not going to have Spencer Sanders run 19 times against Tulsa. But in the biggest game of the season, you will. In a virtual elimination game, you will. And so you have to factor that into price. And I think the other thing here, and when we look at Dave Aranda, he's done a fantastic job, right? But it's still just year 2. Dealt with a pandemic. He doesn't have the best horses. He doesn't have all the guys necessary. It's a lot of scheme-driven stuff defensively. But even looking at this, right, like Baylor's early down defense, like teams have had success bypassing third down on first and second down. There's also an early down advantage for Oklahoma State offensively. So are you going to be able to get Spencer Sanders into third down situations where Oklahoma State struggled a little bit, and then Aranda can scheme things up to make Spencer Sanders uncomfortable? That'll be the key here, right? Because, again, I think the scheme is the best part of Baylor's defense, but if you can't get Spencer Sanders in third and medium, then all of a sudden the scheme isn't as impactful.
Yeah, so much in play here. 2 teams unfamiliar with a game of this magnitude, at least for the most part. I know Baylor was here a couple of years ago, but for Oklahoma State, they'd love nothing more than to be able to cement this season with a conference championship outright for the first time in an eternity. So should be a hell of a game Saturday, early on, 11 a.m. kickoff from Arlington. American Athletic Conference Championship, Payne, played at historic Nippert Stadium, the home of the Cincinnati Bearcats. It's Cincinnati, a 10.5-point home favorite as they'll welcome in the Houston Cougars. Total in the game, 52.5 at FanDuel Sportsbook. The Bearcats, the first non-power team to reach 12-0 since UCF accomplished the feat back in 2019, and just the 5th to do so since Houston in 2011. Pair of the top defenses in the AAC, top 2 in yards per play allowed and yards per carry. When you look at Houston's defense, they have a significant and perhaps critical edge in the run game. The Cougars are 8th in the FBS, allowing just 98 rushing yards per game, and 10th, allowing a shade more than 3 yards per carry. Both teams allow less than 20 points per game, and top 10 nationally in yards per play allowed. But Payne, we were talking off air about Cincinnati and the narrative, and people talking about the style points that they had to try and pick up in games against the likes of Temple or South Florida, outlasting Tulsa. In the last 2 weeks, the Bearcats defense has reminded us exactly why this unit was so highly regarded coming into the season, because it's rare. A group of 5 team has 3 players that'll most likely be playing on Sunday, and you can make the case that their defensive performance against SMU at home and East Carolina on the road last Friday were the 2 best that we've seen them put on the books in quite some time.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. It almost feels like now that there's not this fear of being excluded if you run the table, that there's an actual chance to make the college football playoff. Cincinnati's turned it back on again, right? I mean, you just hammered SMU and ECU. The game's not really close, and now you have Houston in the title game. And this is probably going to sound pretty similar to the breakdown we had when Cincinnati played SMU, because we've seen this movie before, not just a couple weeks ago, but like multiple times over multiple seasons. At this level, like with the kinds of recruits that play in the AAC, you are not going to beat Cincinnati throwing the ball. And the best teams in the AAC throw. And that is why the Bearcats have been dominant, right? Like, now Houston does run it a touch more than SMU. But when you look at their efficiency metrics, it's really a dreadful run offense that's outside the top 100 in rushing success rate and outside the top 60 in a adjusted EPA per rush. So most of the efficiency comes from Clayton Tune finding Nathaniel Dell. That's basically what it comes down to. And they run just to kind of keep things honest. Cincinnati's defense, to your point, has NFL caliber players, and they're at premium positions. Great pass rushers, great coverage guys. Up front, you have Brooks, Sanders, and Beavers, all elite pass rushers. Then the 3 best graded players on the entire Cincinnati defense are in the secondary, right? Bryant, Cook, and Sauce Gardner. 7 interceptions for the 3 guys, only 2 touchdowns allowed. And we mentioned this against SMU, but it bears repeating, and it's only gotten better, as you've said, the last 2 weeks. Those 3 guys in the secondary, they've been targeted 130 times this season. Only 47% of those targets have been caught. Quarterbacks have a 44 passer rating when targeting those 3. It's basically a mission in futility trying to throw at those 3 guys. And I would expect Sauce Gardner to travel with Dell. And I think if you're watching games this week, that might be one of the more fun games within the games to watch, Dell versus Gardner. But Gardner's only been thrown at 34 times in 12 games. Nobody likes throwing his way, because when you do target him, 20 passer rating. So if he limits Dell, then what for Houston's offense? There's also a matchup advantage up front as well, right? Like, Houston's below the national average in havoc allowed. Cincinnati is well above the national average in havoc created. Houston's outside the top 100 in standard down sack rate. I can't really see Houston doing much at all in this game, right? Now the one thing that Houston does have going for it is substantially better defense than what SMU brought to the table. So it does make some sense to me, Todd, that we've seen this come off the 55. Now, it happened less than an hour after open on Sunday. So the price grabbers got to it, and that's why we're now down to 53.5, 53. It does make sense. 55, obviously a massive key number. But you can start to see why this number came down when you start to look at some of these matchups, just because no offense that's been really pass dominant in terms of its efficiency has done anything against Cincinnati for multiple years now.
I think the stat I heard, because I was actually driving to the airport on Friday listening to some of the Cincinnati ECU game, that Sauce Gardner has never allowed a passing touchdown in coverage during his entire time at Cincinnati, which may be the most ridiculous and remarkable stat I've ever heard for a college kid. And I know the AAC isn't the SEC and other leagues, but it just puts in perspective how good he's been and what Marcus Freeman and Luke Fickell have been able to do to put him in a position to excel, a kid who clearly will be playing on Sundays. When you look real quick on the other side, Payne, at Desmond Ridder and company, we know he's been erratic at best. Some of Cincinnati's weapons not truly elite, other than maybe Alex Burks in the passing game and Jerome Ford in the backfield. What's kind of your takeaway? Because you watch with a much more critical eye, and I know you haven't watched a ton of Cincinnati football, I'm sure. But when you watch Ridder, is he going to get an invite to an NFL camp? You think he's got some of the tools to play at the next level or have the potential to really be what a Cinderella would need if Cincinnati's going to contend for a national title?
I think when you look at his size and stature and mobility, and he does have some arm strength, I've seen mocks where he's like the 5th quarterback taken. I don't know if that's ultimately what unfolds, but guys that do that professionally claim that he's kind of in that like 4 to 7 range of quarterbacks taken in the 2022 draft this April. In terms of what they're able to do offensively, Ford obviously is huge to get their ground game going. But one thing I will say in this game is Houston's defense appears to be substantially better than when they met last year, right? Donovan Mutin is back in the middle of Houston's defense. He's kind of the leader and heartbeat of that unit. Had an injury scare on the first drive of the Memphis game. Every single report over the last 2 days is he'll be back. And, that total last year closed like 52.5. And Houston finished the year with a defense just inside the top 70 in efficiency. It's a top 20 defense this year. And so that's what's intriguing to me is this will be a tougher task for Cincinnati offensively than, hanging 38 on Houston last year just because Houston's defense has improved. Now, you brought to my attention, right, the competition hasn't been great that Houston's faced, and there's been some situations towards the middle part of the season where some AAC offenses that move the ball a little bit through the air have given them trouble. Even last week, I know that was a total that we were on. We were on the UConn Houston under 56. I believe it closed like 53.5. Obviously, a pick six hurts, and that's what you lose the total by is one score. But there was a situation in that game where, you saw UConn on 3rd and 20. He was forced to drop back and pass, hit an explosive. And so this is clearly a step up in class facing Cincinnati's pass game. And Ridder has shown improvements, and there are some weapons outside that Cincinnati hasn't had in recent years. So I do think Houston's defense has improved. But I think there's some areas here where that Cincinnati can attack them and have some success.
Should be an interesting game. We'll see exactly what the weather forecast looks like. All indications are cool and clear like you'd expect in Cincinnati. Yes. And we'll see if the Houston boys can bundle up and perform in cold weather, something that they're probably not all that accustomed to, even after having played out in East Hartford last week against the UConn Huskies. To a game where weather will not be a factor in the Mercedes-Benz Dome in Atlanta, Georgia takes on Alabama for SEC supremacy. Georgia, a 6.5-point favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook, total down to 48.5 at FanDuel, one of the lowest numbers out there in the market. 14th appearance for Alabama in the SEC title game, 9th for Georgia. Georgia, their 3rd in 4 years after they didn't appear in the title game at all between 2013 to 2017. Alabama, they've won 6 straight games over the Georgia Bulldogs, and these are 2 of the top 3 teams when it comes to converting 3rd and longs this season. Teams both rank 5th and 6th in points per drive. A lot of familiarity between Georgia backup JT Daniels and Bryce Young, the two have talked about their relationship that exists off the field as Southern California kids. I ask a question here, Payne, that's tough to try and quantify, and it may not be a fair way to even look when you're assessing the handicap. Alabama is playing, for all intents and purposes, their playoff lives. Georgia, regardless of how things unfold Saturday, I think 99.9% of us believe they're already into the college football playoff. Should that play a role in how you handicap this, or do you throw that out and go, hey, look, Georgia's got a defense that's going to attack Bryce Young right from the opening kickoff, and it's up to Nick Saban and Bill O'Brien to scheme up ways to keep their starting quarterback from ending up in a body bag?
Yeah, I don't get the vibe that Georgia's going to lay down in the SEC championship game. That's, in a heated rivalry where, recruiting is huge. I don't see that being a situation. That's just my take. I know it's been floated out there that Georgia doesn't care about the game and it's meaningless to them. It's not really conversations that I typically try to get myself involved in. But hey, maybe that's what'll happen. And certainly, if Alabama wins, that'll be the narrative, right? Georgia didn't care, didn't want to be there, didn't think an SEC championship against a rival, and head coaches that have familiarity. They didn't. Just Kirby laid down. when you look at Bama's offense, I'm sure you will kind of hear people attempt to downplay Georgia's defense because they like Alabama in this spot. And the question will be like, who have they played? Right? Their secondary hasn't been tested. And I think that's probably fair, I guess. But we do have schedule-adjusted metrics. Those exist. And being able to remove garbage time is a thing. And even when you remove garbage time and adjust for opponent, Georgia's defense is number 1 in EPA per play allowed. And then when you actually dissect the schedule, with a win this weekend, Georgia's being the only team in the country with 4 wins against the College Football Committee's top 25. Kentucky, who's bullied everybody, looked like a toddler in the trenches. All of the talk of Tennessee's high-flying offense with Hendon Hooker, and people thought they had a shot to stay close. That offense just completely grounded. Arkansas was shut out. Clemson has regained momentum as one of the 10 best teams in the country by our numbers again right now. So when you kind of put it in that context, suddenly Georgia's profile is not as bad as people think. When it comes to this matchup specifically, I think you do have to wonder, and it's an obvious, right? Like, how is Alabama's O-line holding up here? And that's something from the onset, Todd, that we kind of were ahead of the market on, right? Like, everyone's like, hey, we're just going to throw Alabama in the national championship game after they beat Miami. And it's like, O-line was kind of a problem there. And nothing's really changed after 12 weeks. Bryce Young pressured on 33% of his dropbacks against Auburn last week, and for the first time all season, it really bothered him. He was horrific under pressure, 42% adjusted completion percentage, 4.5 an attempt, 11 passer rating in the Iron Bowl for Bryce Young. This feels really like it's going to be completely on Bryce Young, right? Like, he's got to have some great escapability. He's going to have to be accurate. He's going to have to get the ball out on time, throw on the run. Like, it's really a situation where you look at this and it's like, where's Alabama going to have success, right? Probably not on the ground. I know the O-line, again, hasn't been good in pass protection, but it's also outside the top 40 in line yards, opportunity rate, and stuff rate allowed. In total, like, Bama's right now 80th in EPA per rush. Brian Robinson Jr., Bama's workhorse back, left the Auburn game with a pulled hamstring, didn't return. That tells me that it's somewhat serious, right? Your playoff life was on the line. In your biggest rivalry game in state, Brian Robinson didn't return. And that is a guy who has made yards in spite of a shoddy offensive line. Brian Robinson has a 42% broken tackle rate, nearly 3.5 yards per carry after contact. That would be a big loss here. You also have to remember Jace McClellan and Roydell Williams are out. And basically that leaves Trey Sanders as the only scholarship running back on Alabama's roster. So if Georgia doesn't have to respect run, it becomes Bryce Young throwing in known passing situations with a problematic O-line that's 89th in sack rate allowed on passing downs against a Georgia defense that's elite, getting to the quarterback and causing havoc. Bill O'Brien is going to have to come up with something here. And I think we've talked about this before, right? Georgia plays a style defensively that's about having better Jimmies and Joes than you. It's not overly sophisticated, and they can be too aggressive at times, and rubs and picks are really needed, and misdirection and RPOs and play action. Those are things that at least give you a chance. Bama uses a decent amount of that. Almost 42% of Bryce Young's throws come with either play action or an RPO element. But this is a pretty difficult task, and I'll throw this back to you because I know you've been a little bit more critical of Alabama's offense and you watch them far more than I do, but you've really been outspoken about Bama's weapons, and you're not completely sold on like the trio of Williams, Mechie, and Latu being game breakers. Obviously, right? We all know that those weapons aren't as good as what they've had in the past. I don't think they're horrific, but you tend to be a little bit more down on them. Are those three good enough to beat Georgia's defense?
I wouldn't say horrific. Don't get me wrong there. These are still 5-star recruits, and they're plenty capable. I mean, we saw Alabama pull another 5-star off the scrap heap who had one catch in the previous 2 games, who caught the biggest pass, arguably, of Alabama's entire season to date in the corner of the end zone against Auburn. But you watch Mechie, and he operates underneath a little bit more. Jamison Williams, the big play threat going down the field. And I just think each of those guys are bucketed a little bit more than the likes of a Jalen Waddle or Devontae Smith. They don't provide that same level of versatility versatility. And when you watch for stretches, they don't make some of the tougher grabs in traffic that are going to be required against a Georgia team where there's going to be tight windows to throw into. It's going to be a lot of read and react where Bryce Young has to get the ball out of his hands quickly. And hey, look, it's a fluid situation. We'll try and gauge these guys based on what we see in this particular spot. But I think Bryce Young would clearly benefit if he had the tandem or trio of weapons that Mac Jones had at his disposal last year. And I do wonder if Jamison Williams will still be out there on special teams, leading with the crown of his helmet to try and make tackles midway through the second quarter, like we saw last week in the Iron Bowl.
Yes. Now, other side of the ball, you want to get into that? I know I'm the only guy in this podcast that leads the Stetson
you're the
Bennett
president of the
club.
fan club. So, I mean, am I going to get
You were kicked out midway through the Tennessee.
Am I going to get an unbiased assessment here of Stetson Bennett being the second coming to try and be able to take over? Because I do think when you look at Georgia, everyone talks.
Hey, I just like a good underdog story. That's
here
it.
we go. He played at Georgia.
I'm amped up for Kurt Warner's movie on Christmas Day.
Yeah, he played for Georgia, went to community college. He came back. JT Daniels gets nicked up, and here we are at this point. Because I'll take the school of thought, Payne, that people go, oh, well, to beat Georgia, you have to have an elite offense, and that's the way that you have to attack their best unit. I'll go the other way, and I'll say that to beat Georgia, you have to have an elite defense that forces Georgia to be in a very difficult situation because they don't really have a ton of true 5 stars that are playing a big role for what they do offensively, whether it's Stetson Bennett, whether it's White, Cook, or McIntosh in the backfield. I mean, Bowers is a star. He's going to be an NFL caliber tight end. He's going to play on Sundays. They did get George Pickens back on the field last week against Georgia Tech. It'll be interesting to watch what his snap count looks like and how he's utilized. Still very much recovering from that knee injury. I don't think he'll be at 100%. But against the top defenses, I mean, they've only really played one all season, and that was in Clemson week 1. And while that feels like an eternity ago, I do wonder how this Georgia offense fares against an Alabama defense that is clearly the better and more dynamic unit that Nick Saban's team will bring to Atlanta for the championship game.
I somewhat agree, right? I mean, it's cliche, but you can only play who's in front of you. But it is really important at the same time to talk schedule because there's a ton of hidden value in assessing actual team strength by who you play. There's no doubt about that. But when I look at schedule-adjusted EPA, Clemson, UAB, South Carolina, Arkansas, Auburn, and Florida, all inside the top 40 defenses in the country. And I think maybe we have some recency bias when other teams are playing like really big, meaningful games late in the season, and we see Georgia breezing through Charleston Southern and Georgia Tech. I kind of look at that as a bonus, right? I mean, we know what Georgia is. We know that they're probably in the college football playoff no matter what. They control their own destiny. Like, this is probably a game where they lose, and they're still gold, but I would rather be playing Charleston Southern and Georgia Tech and having my guys build up a lather the week before the SEC championship game than Alabama, who was on the road at Jordan-Hare against their in-state rival, surviving overtime. That's kind of how I look at that situation. I think Georgia's the well more rested and healthy team here, right? Now, Stetson Bennett, you're going to bust my balls here about this, but I just think there's still a lot of people uncertain about him because he doesn't have 5 stars in front of his name, to your point, and he doesn't have the biggest arm or the largest frame. And this isn't being biased, right? These are just numbers, right? This is he's third in the country in EPA per pass. Only Grayson McCall and C.J. Stroud have been better than Stetson Bennett. Now, no doubt, right, some of these numbers, there needs to be some context put in them, and Bennett hasn't been asked to throw as much as those guys, and he hasn't been really forced to make meaningful throws based upon score and situation and all of that stuff. But I could see that happening here. And unless Georgia's just mulling Alabama in the trenches, and the metrics don't quite indicate that'll happen, although you could see kind of a wearing down situation at some point based upon that game last week that they played. But I would fully anticipate Todd Monken throwing more on first down than we've seen this season. Based upon Bama's run defense and early down defense, that's probably the best strategy, right? Like Bama's number 2 in defensive line yards, 8th in stuff rate, number 1 in EPA per rush allowed. Monken would be really smart to throw on first down, attack Alabama's secondary, right? That they're 51st in passing success rate allowed, outside the top 40 in EPA per pass allowed. So that is the way to attack Bama's through the air and do it on early downs when Stetson Bennett's most comfortable. My gut tells me that Todd Monken's held some things back offensively. There's going to be a surprise or two, a formation or a wrinkle nobody's seen yet because he hasn't had to use it. He hasn't had to break it out based upon, again, score and situation this season. And then you have 3 tight ends that you can really line up in a multitude of formations, right? You can disguise what you want to do. You have Bowers, Fitzpatrick, and Washington. They can all block. They can all catch. They're going to help chip guys like Anderson. When Georgia goes heavy, they're probably going to force Anderson to be a coverage guy at times rather than a pass rusher, which is his best attribute. Look at some of the matchups. Bama's safety, Jordan Battle. He's going to have to limit those tight ends. He's far and away Bama's best coverage guy, a 26 passer rating allowed when targeted. So he'll be monumental in this game trying to hang with those tight ends. There are 2 situational metrics that could come into play here, like situational football that we talk about all the time that sometimes can swing these games. If Bama can hold up on early downs, let's see what Georgia is on third down. Right now, the Bulldogs, 38% success on third and fourth down, barely inside the top 100 in the country for Georgia's offense on that down. And they haven't really been put in much of a position where third downs have been meaningful. And that could be a thing here. The other element to this is for Bama's defense, they have not been great stopping teams in the green and red zone. Bama's allowed 4 points per trip inside their 40. So anytime an opponent hits their 40-yard line or inside of it, they're averaging 4 points. Not good. When offenses hit Bama's red zone, they've given up a 60% touchdown rate. That's 9th worst in the SEC. So there are some little situational football things here that could go a long way to deciding this game. So let's see how Georgia performs offensively on third down, something that they, again, haven't been faced with often. And then when Georgia does get into the green and red zones, can Alabama actually hold the 3 or less?
Been interesting to watch the market movement on this game as well. We saw some shops open this price a few weeks ago as low as Georgia -3. You're now out in that 6.5 range, total down a touch, as we talked about, from 51.5 at the peak down to 48.5. I think, to your point, if Stetson Bennett comes out throwing the ball early and often and forces Alabama to play from behind, things could snowball. But a fascinating game nonetheless, knowing how fast the track we've typically grown accustomed to seeing in Atlanta.
Do we think this gets to 7? I mean, it just looks like it's going to be nothing but one-way Georgia money here.
I think there's a chance that recreational shops will get to 7. I would be surprised if books known to deal to professionals will give them the opportunity to get a 7 flat.
I completely agree there.
So, especially as we start to hear more and more in the build-up to the game about Nick Saban being an underdog of this magnitude and everything else that'll factor in. We do realize that coaching can be the great equalizer even in college football, sometimes when you're a little bit outmanned in the trenches and some other areas. So, hell of a game to watch unfold on Saturday afternoon. Saturday night in Charlotte, it's the Wake Forest Demon Deacons taking on the Pittsburgh Panthers. And Pitt, a 2.5-point favorite at the FanDuel Sportsbook. Total in this game, 72.5. Quarterback battle for the ages by ACC standards when you look at the seasons that Sam Hartman and Kenny Pickett have put on the books. Wake will be back in the title game for the first time since defeating Georgia Tech 9-6 back in 2006. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this game will be a little bit higher scoring for the Demon Deacons than what we saw 15 years ago. Deacons, 7 wins in conference are a school record. Pitt also wins 7 games in the ACC for the first time in conference history. And when you look at Wake Forest, Payne, you've been a bigger fan of Sam Hartman than maybe anybody else outside of the Hartman family over the last couple seasons, and he hasn't disappointed. 60% completion percentage, 8.8 yards per attempt, a touchdown interception ratio of 8-1, passer rating of nearly 156, all career best, 4th quarterback in ACC history with 30 passing touchdowns and 10 rushing touchdowns in a single season, the first to accomplish this feat since Lamar Jackson back in 2016, and he's got a wealth of weapons at his disposal, and A.T. Perry and Ja'Cory Roberson. Christian Beal-Smith returned to action with a limited workload last week against BC. But when you look at Pittsburgh, this defense probably doesn't get enough credit for how good they are when it comes to wreaking havoc with their pass rush and being able to sell out and make opposing offenses one-dimensional.
Yeah, I mean, 2 great quarterbacks, 2 good offenses, but I do think, to your point, the difference I see, at least on paper, is defensively, and the other is schedules. You know, Pittsburgh's defense plays, if you've watched, really aggressive, right? And they can be beaten for an explosive or two over the top, but it's a defense that's on the fringe of being top 25 in overall EPA per play allowed. Do a really good job up front at the point of attack. Pittsburgh's top 15 in line yards and stuff rate. Their front sevens created havoc at a 14% rate, which is one of the best rates in the ACC. And we know Wake Forest loves to kind of hold that mesh point as long as possible to disguise run or pass. If you can be disruptive up front and you can force Sam Hartman's hand earlier than he wants, I think that's goes a long way. But you're looking at a Pittsburgh defense, whether it's against the run, pass, early downs, or on that money down, third down, they're substantially better than Wake Forest defense across the board. And so I think that is one of the glaring things here is like when you have two high-powered offenses like we have in this game, which is the unit that can actually force a stop or two? And all signs point to that being Pittsburgh, right? Like sometimes in these games when you have a total where this one is located in the 70s, it's like, hey, letting a field goal up is good. That's a positive, right? Getting a turnover is a positive, and that's a great stop. And I just think Pittsburgh's well-positioned to be that defense in this game to get the occasional stop. The other thing that I mentioned that stood out to me was schedule. And obviously, right, two ACC teams, so there's a bunch of common opponents. And you look across the board, right, both teams beat up on Duke like everybody has. But there's three other games I think that are worth focusing on. And it's both Wake and Pittsburgh played Syracuse, North Carolina, and Clemson. And starting with Syracuse, Pittsburgh was a net positive 13% in success rate in that game, won by 3 scores. Wake Forest, on the other hand, against Syracuse, was a net negative 13% in success rate. Game required overtime for Wake Forest to win. Then you go to the Clemson game. Pittsburgh was a net positive 0.18 EPA per play and won by double digits. Wake Forest loses to Clemson by 3 touchdowns and was a net negative 0.19 EPA per play. Against North Carolina, Pittsburgh built a big lead, held on. They were a net positive 13% in success rate. Wake Forest lost to North Carolina, right? We were on that game. And they were a net negative 9% in success rate. So 3 common opponents, 3 substantially different results in the advanced box scores. It's extremely difficult to overlook that. Now, our projection, I'm looking at it right now, we make Pittsburgh minus 3.2 with factoring the game being played in Charlotte. So again, to my eyes, number grabbers did a great job laying 2 on Sunday and getting out ahead of this key number here, Todd. Just kind of looking at things, and it wouldn't shock me if this potentially trended to 3.5.
What is interesting about this, and it's, like we talk about home field advantage sometimes on neutral fields, I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, Payne, if it's more of a home field advantage for Pittsburgh, even this far away from home. When you look at the demand for tickets through the Pittsburgh fan base, I mean, some of the videos that have circulated there from poking around, I think all the flights out of Pittsburgh have been sold out on Friday to try and get down there for the game. And the one thing about Wake Forest that can work against them, even playing, only a stone's throw away from home, it's one of the smallest undergraduate student bodies anywhere in Division I football. So it makes it tough to have that prominent alumni base to kind of stack a stadium and create that home field advantage, something that Pitt would have had to contend with should they have met NC State or Clemson in the state of North Carolina.
Makes sense, yeah. Again, we make the number 3.2, so I could see value on why 2 was taken.
Yep, no doubt about it, and we'll see both of these quarterbacks try and improve their draft stock. Kenny Pickett, we know, has rapidly climbed up draft boards. Not sure he's going to have enough in the tank to win the Heisman Trophy, currently priced at 16-1 at FanDuel Sportsbook. Before we get into the final game, which is the Big Ten Championship, I want to encourage all of you to follow Payne on Twitter, at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there as well. Most importantly, follow the podcast, at Bet the Board Pod, for all sorts of great contest updates and everything else that we bring to you on a weekly basis. And before you bet any of the big games this Saturday, FanDuel.com. Use the promo code BetTheBoard. Take advantage of some of the risk-free $1,000 free bet offers that are available, enhanced odds on some of the biggest games, and whether it's college football, college basketball, the National Football League, or any other sports that you want to wager on, FanDuel has one of the most extensive sports betting menus of anybody out there in the space. You described them so eloquently at the start of the show, Payne, as burnt toast. That, of course, being the Iowa Hawkeyes, who are installed as a 10.5-point underdog at FanDuel, as they'll go to Indianapolis to take on the Michigan Wolverines. Total on the game, 43.5. Michigan, first ever appearance in the Big Ten Championship. Last outright conference title came back in 2003. Iowa makes their first appearance since 2015, a game they lost 16-13 to Michigan State. The last outright title for the Hawkeyes back in 1985. Wisconsin and Ohio State have accounted for 7 of the last 11 conference championships, so we'll get a little bit of fresh blood here. And Iowa, to get to this point in the most Iowa win maybe of their entire season, they erase a 21-6 deficit against Nebraska late in the third quarter that included a block punt, a safety, chip shot, field goals, and Wisconsin crumbled under the pressure against Minnesota. But if Iowa's going to be successful in this game against Michigan, Payne, is it more about Spencer Petras and the offense showing a little bit of a pulse for the first time all year, or about Iowa locking in the trenches and leaning in on that very talented defense that's held seemingly every opponent since the beginning of 2018 to 28 points or less?
Yeah, I think this is... Sorry, getting distracted here. My internet is going in and out, and the Don Best screen's flickering here a bit. This is one of the tougher games for me because two things are pulling in opposite directions. And by the price, our numbers say this game is short. We make Michigan minus 13. And relative to public perception, I think everyone knows I'm not as high on Michigan's defense even after last week. And yet, we get to 13. Iowa's offense against Michigan's defense is the largest mismatch metrically of the entire week. There's quarterback issues for Iowa. The weapons outside for Iowa do not scare anybody. All week, Iowa's talked about being a run-first team and getting back to basics because that's who they are and that's how they want to operate and that's how they've always recruited and they want to be a run-first team. I just don't understand how that's the philosophy. I understand the quarterback situation's a mess, but Iowa's 120th in line yards. Their offensive line allows 23% of runs to be stuffed at or behind the line of scrimmage. That's 120th in the country. Only 44% of the time, Iowa's O-line is credited with creating at least 4 yards of space for its running backs. That's outside the top 100. So basically, Iowa wants to double down on something they're not good at, and is the reason the offense stinks. Now, Spencer Petras was struggling and then had a little bit of an injury and got benched, and then in comes Alex Padilla, and he's been even worse than Petras, and so now we have Spencer Petras starting again. If Iowa can't run, then we're basically putting it on Spencer Petras again. And Iowa's outside the top 90 in both early down EPA and the ability to bypass third down on first and second down. So Iowa's going to be in third and medium plus situations, and that basically puts Aiden Hutchinson and David Ajabo in position to pin their ears back and get after the quarterback. And Iowa's starting tackles have graded out bad and horrific in pass blocking this season. When you just kind of look at this team overall, Iowa has lived off turnovers and field position. Iowa's defense is damn good, right? And that's kind of how they've made their hay as a team this season. But Michigan doesn't turn it over, and Michigan has the second most efficient special teams units. So the luck stuff might not actually be a thing here. And I know being contrarian and thinking outside the box kind of lends itself to value. And certainly Michigan's not going to play at the level we saw them last week. That's impossible to do, right? When everyone says you played your best game of the year, that's your best game of the year for a reason.
Best game in 9 years.
Best. Right. And so the problem is I haven't been high on Iowa at any point in the season.
Because they stink?
Before the season started, or whether it was, when they were luck boxing and turning teams over on their way to the 6-0 start. I mean, you think about this. From the Penn State game onwards, only reason you beat Penn State is because Sean Clifford got injured. You were down 14 when Clifford was in the game. Then he leaves, and you barely battle back to win. Finally, Iowa gets curb stomped the next week at home by Purdue. Lose by 3 scores as a double-digit home favorite. Purdue is a net positive 0.198 EPA per play. Wisconsin hammers you by 3 scores. Iowa had a 0% success rate in the first quarter and followed that up with a whopping 8% success rate in the second quarter. Then Iowa hits the road for Northwestern. Iowa was a double-digit favorite, won by 5, despite being a net negative 2% in success rate against a Pat Fitzgerald team that we have power rated just inside the top 90. Big win there. The next week, Minnesota comes to town. We are on the dog. We all cover. Awesome. Minnesota should have won the damn game outright. Outgained Iowa by 132 yards in Kinnick. Iowa was held to 277 yards. 100 of them came on 2 plays. A broken coverage on a quick flip turnaround, and then a pass thrown 3 yards behind the line of scrimmage where 3 guys missed tackles and a wide receiver ran it in. 177 total yards on every other play in that game. Give Iowa credit. They beat Illinois. Still couldn't exceed odds-maker expectation in that game. And then last week against Nebraska, with a chance to go to the Big Ten championship game, win, and apply pressure on Wisconsin, Iowa's down 21-6 with a minute to go in the third quarter to a backup quarterback named Logan Smothers. Okay? Right? Like, Nebraska does what Nebraska does and implodes late. Iowa locates the horseshoe up their ass one more time with a non-offensive touchdown. And they win the game despite being a net negative 10% in success rate, and also lost the net EPA per play battle. For the last 6 games, Iowa has either been drubbed in the advanced box score or didn't exceed oddsmaker expectation in every single one of their games. So the number and matchup would typically dictate a play on Michigan this week against Iowa. The problem is, the information I'm getting, at least as of now, Wednesday morning, is Iowa's going to be the side. Michigan, we obviously know, as you alluded to, biggest win in the Harbaugh era over its biggest rival. Michigan is in the driver's seat for the college football playoff. There is no need for style points. Just win, right? No need to run it up. Just win. And then laying 10.5, 11 points in a game with a total at 43.5 is typically a difficult proposition. So that's kind of where I am on this game. I'm not quite sure. I think Iowa stinks. I think they're worse than what their metrics indicate, and it's why, even though I'm not as high on Michigan as others, I still see value in Michigan because of the number 13, but it's virtually impossible to play Michigan after last week, right? I mean, it's just very difficult, and you hate to say that, right? But it just, you're typically not going to win money laying double digits with a total of 43.5 after that team just had their biggest win in a decade, right? So I'm kind of off this game altogether, but I'm probably not going. I guess my point here is, eventually when Iowa comes in from the guys that I speak with, it's probably going to be a game where I just pass and I'm on the sidelines.
Oh, how the fact you haven't been able to quantify the fairy dust that Iowa plays with on a week-in, week-out basis this season is beyond me. When you look at a team that's plus 13 in turnovers, they've scored 6 non-offensive touchdowns to their opponent's 0, and the fact that their starting average field position is at the 36-yard line, I guess goes to show what this team has been able to accomplish, and it reminds me an awful lot of the Chicago Bears in Matt Nagy's first season, where the offense didn't have to do much because the defense set them up for success. So we'll see early on in this game if Michigan can remain as versatile offensively as we've seen, because that's one thing that kept coming out in a lot of the reading for this game, that Michigan talked about how opposing defenses can't key on just one player for this team, whether it's Hassan Haskins last week with 5 touchdowns, Blake Corum before he was dealing with a foot injury, Eric All and what he brings to the tight end spot, or a guy like Donovan Edwards who caught 10 balls for 170 yards in their win against Maryland. This Michigan offense is a lot more dynamic than I think they're given credit for, and we'll have to see, not for just this week, but if it was a changing of the guard with that dominant performance against Ohio State, and they're able to bridge the gap going forward against the Scarlet and Gray in the Big Ten East.
It's lining up very well for next year, that's for sure, right? J.J. McCarthy, you mentioned Edwards, who is just a fantastic back, and his versatility has really given that offense some pop. And so all of a sudden, when you're looking out wide and you're saying, there's not a ton of like great weapons yet that can crush you outside for Michigan, you do have some nice tight ends, and Corum and Edwards catching the ball out of the backfield has been absolutely ridiculous. And so that's probably a good place to focus there is, Iowa's got a great defense, and typically you're not going to want to like run your head into a brick wall. And the secondary is good, but I think there are some advantages there where you can get Edwards and Corum out in the pass game on those linebackers, which appear to be a touch slow to my eye. And so maybe that's where Michigan does have the advantage. And again, the one thing Iowa's feasted on is great field position, being able to turn teams over. And Michigan's fantastic in special teams, and they don't turn the ball over. So you're really kind of looking for ways Iowa's able to score in this game. Now, maybe just Michigan's flat as a board. It's just difficult to see that being the case, knowing what's on the line here. Suddenly that win last week really loses its luster if you're ousted from the college football playoff and don't have a chance at a championship run.
Oh, should be an interesting game for sure from Indy. We'll see if Michigan can finally get their monkey off the back and play for one of the biggest prizes in all of college football. 6 marquee games to keep your eyes on across Friday and Saturday. I know we didn't have a chance to get to some of the Group of 5 matchups that are fascinating in their own right, with Bailey Zappi and the high-powered Western Kentucky Hilltopper offense going to take on UT San Antonio. Appalachian State looking for a little bit of revenge against Lafayette. But the reality of it is there aren't enough hours in the day for us to deep dive every single game on the docket. However, there is one final order of business, as we always do around these parts when we put a bow on the college football season other than the bowl games that are looming. It's where we're going to go to try and find an investable opportunity on the college football card this weekend.
Yeah, and we're going to go, and we discussed this off air a little bit, kind of go off the grid. And, it's not the most liquid of markets. When I look at this board this week, Todd, right, there's not a ton of value, right, in some of the numbers. Like, oddsmakers did a really good job pricing games this week, in my mind. And there aren't, like, a ton of, like, overwhelming, just like, hey, this is a fantastic matchup in every single area. And so, I'll be candid, I have not bet a college football game yet this week. But the one I will be gravitating towards is I think there is some value, because I know we like the under a little bit here, but kind of focusing on Houston and Cincinnati. Let's go with Houston's team total under 21.5. We'll call it playable down to 21, but we'll go with 21.5 as the number. I think there's just what we have seen, and you can go back to the breakdown of this game. It'll be timestamped, but what we have just seen over time is if you want to throw on Cincinnati at the AAC level, it's impossible to do. It just hasn't been done. None of these teams have. We tried to watch SMU do it. Did not work out well. And so I think it's going to be difficult for Houston. And really, their pass game is predicated on one guy, in Nathaniel Dell. Is Sauce Gardner going to get truly trounced in that matchup? I don't see that being the case. And then you look at Houston's front. I would say their weakness offensively is their O-line, right? 90th in line yards, 112th in the country in stuff rate allowed. And so I know they are a little bit more run happy than SMU. They're not overly efficient running. So I don't know if that's quite the threat. The other element here is you have 2 really slow teams. And that may shock some people when you think about Houston and them throwing the ball. Like, they're outside the top 100 in pace. Cincinnati, outside the top 70 in pace. So you do have that slow down factor here as well. At 55, as I alluded to, which is a very key number, I like that under. But we kind of now, as we're navigating this a little bit, I think kind of gravitating towards Houston's team total under is the best way to go at 21.5.
We get to that time of year where it's always tough to try and find spots, and we preach bankroll management around here. It's a marathon, not a sprint, that the money is just as green you can find on a week 6 college football game as you can bet on Championship Saturday. So it's not here to play father or anything along those lines or issue PSAs, but want to encourage all of you, our loyal listeners who've been with us all season long. You've profited quite handsomely. No reason to go crazy as the college football season winds down. We'll inevitably find a bowl or two that we can share with you going forward, and still plenty of damage to be done in the National Football League. So shop around, try and grab the 21.5 on the Houston team total. Bet accordingly, bet responsibly, and hopefully we can do a little bit of damage as we put a wrap on what has been a very profitable college football campaign. Any fun?
I think you said that perfectly, right? Like, at the end of the day, the reason, and we've said this for years, and I don't know if we've mentioned it this year, so we have a lot of new listeners, and for the old listeners, it will be like, oh, this again. But at the end of the day, the biggest advantage you have as a bettor is being able to pick and choose. Odds makers have to put a line on every single game. And so it doesn't shock me that lines are a little bit tighter on a board that has 15 games and not 65 games. And so this is going to be a pretty high volume weekend. It makes some sense to have your numbers a little bit tighter. But that's basically, I think you hit this perfectly, right? Like sometimes there just isn't an advantage in the market. And, for us personally, like, I have 1,000 bets this year at least, right? Like one game becomes irrelevant to me. And I'm sure from now until game time, we'll locate something else. But as we record this, that is the favorite that we have is Houston team total under 21.5.
Yep, a little bit tougher on a Wednesday sometimes as well, as there'll be other injury information and everything else. And hey, that's we know everyone is responsible. They're entitled to handle their bankrolls accordingly, but it goes without saying we want to look out for the longevity, keep you guys in the game a lot longer rather than issuing 12 to 14 games and calling them all our best bets every single weekend throughout the football season. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. If you haven't already deposited in FanDuel, I'm not quite sure what you're waiting for. Use the promo code Bet the Board. Take advantage of everything they have for you there. Any final parting shots, Payne, before we take a 24-hour break and we run it right back with the National Football League Week 13?
No. We will be back tomorrow. We'll get off this now, and I can figure out why my internet is crapping out.
Yeah, go take care of that connectivity issue over there. We don't want that causing a problem for us going forward around here. So best of luck to all of you, our loyal listeners, with all of your championship weekend investments. And with a Houston team total under on Saturday afternoon, hopefully we'll see you at the window.